Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. You hear me say it every week. This week's no different. We have a great guest for you today, and I think you will find this guest and this topic very fascinating, not only as you grieve, but for beyond that as well, when you are really reclaiming your life and your person, as I did. So let's move on. Today with us is Suzanne Anderson. Suzanne, hi, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Kathy. Thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you. Could you just give our listeners a little bit of your background, please?
Right. I'd be delighted to do that. I'll say maybe I'll just start with the moment I'm in right now. I'd say I'm a woman in the phase of my life coming out of a very, very difficult loss and complete change in my life the way it was, which we'll get into, making my way in the world, and I'd say I'm doing that from the ground not only of all the experiences I've had in my life prior to the enormous loss I suffered, but also because of my experience of moving through the loss. I'm a psychologist by training and a coach and a leadership consultant, and I have worked for many decades in the space of women, actually, and development primarily. That was my research for 10 years, looking at what it would be for women to really start showing up in the world with more of their authentic nature happening. So that's who I am. I think that maybe gives us a good place to start.
That it certainly does. Thank you for sharing that. This loss you mentioned. Now, I personally have endured the loss of my father, an infant son, a newborn, actually, that died within 24 hours of being born. And because he was whisked off to another NICU, I never saw him, never held him, never touched him. And the death of my mother. Those three experiences, in looking back now, I see that I never really grieved them fully or correctly. It wasn't until my most recent loss, the loss of my husband, now 5 years ago, that I really feel like I have grieved, have learned what grief is, have experienced it fully, continue to grieve. I'm convinced I will grieve for the rest of my life. But I have been able to grow in my grief and through my grief. And what I claim I have done, I have redefined my life to a life in which I'm happy. And I never thought I would be able to say that. I was given a copy of your book, which is coming out in June, as I understand it. The title is You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide through trauma and loss. I loved the title, You Make Your Path by Walking, because I talk a lot about grief journeys and the path I'm on and the path I've already traveled. My favorite poem from my junior high school days was The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. So the idea and concept of a path and walking that path has always been a part of my life. I have to confess, though, I picked up your book and I started reading it, and I got so confused initially because there were so many concepts. So the very, very first question I really want to ask you, Suzanne, you use the term Mysterial Woman. Mysterial Woman. Could you help me identify what that really means?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm just respond to some of the other things you were saying. I'll just that poem is also one of my favorite poems. two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and sorry, I could not travel both. And being
Yes.
one traveler long, I stood and gazed down both as far as I could.
Yes.
So that's a beautiful poem that speaks to choices we would make in our lives,
Absolutely.
that I really can also very much resonate with. Well, the research that I did for many years around women, as I already described, and these ways of being in the world that I feel are coming online right now as an evolutionary move forward, literally, of the human species.
Yes. Yes.
We started to see these qualities or ways of being, and I didn't have a word to describe what we were seeing. We were seeing women actually showing up in these ways that were very, very different. And one day, this word, mysterial, just popped through me. I said it out loud. I said, these women are like, they're mysterial because they had this mystery. They had this ability to be with the mystery, to be with ambiguity, with uncertainty, with the not knowing, which all of us who have been through the grief journey know that is a huge piece of what we
Yes.
need to do. And then they had this medial capacity, which is a Jungian term that it basically means the ability to walk the middle way, to be
Mhm.
in the middle of the chaos. And again, for those of us going through grief, we know what that is, to find some path through all the chaos. And those, I just put the words together. And then when I said it out loud, my co-author was with me, and we said we could feel something that actually happened in the naming of that. And we thought, why can't we invent a word? I mean, who says we can't invent a word? We are trying to
Right.
describe something that the patriarchy has never named before and hasn't seen. So of course there's a new
Hmm.
word for it. So that's what that is.
Well, it's great, and it's really the perfect word for it. One that, of course, I'd never heard before. I started reading your book, but as you explained in your book and everything, little pieces, and especially what you've just told me right now, it fits it perfectly. And I, like many, many women, have kind of been caught up in this entire trend, for lack of a better word for me, for women to claim these identities, these traits, these attributes, and use them to grow and to become new women, new
Hmm.
people, to be able to give back, to be able to support, help, aid, care for, and grow within themselves, even, I guess is the best way I can put it. So it's very exciting to me that you have captured this whole thing, especially with a word. And I could tell you a story about creating a word and an entire campaign. All I'll do is offer the word orbisculate, and I encourage you
Okay.
to look it up. It's a word that never used to exist, but now does. So you mentioned in your intro, Suzanne, that you suffered an enormous loss. Had you already gone through your psychological training before
I
you
have.
experienced this loss?
Right. The work that I had done for many years is in that space. In fact, the work I do is what I call developmental trauma work. So I'm working with women to go back and find those places in our own development where we left parts of ourselves behind. We call that developmental trauma. And
Okay.
so I certainly knew, quite a lot about the psychodynamics of developmental trauma. And this, I was just getting ready, in fact, to bring the first book, my book, which has actually became an award-winning book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman,
Hmm.
out. The manuscript was finished. We were ready to find a publisher, and then I came home to find my husband dead, and by suicide. So that
Oh, I'm
was
so
an
sorry.
enormous, as you obviously read,
Absolutely.
shift in the direction I thought I was going, and
Yes.
the direction
Yes.
that I was actually going to go.
Yes. Yes. Did you find that your training and all of your research helped you through that?
Absolutely, I would say my was yes, my training. I understood a lot of things, but even more than that was that I this is about a way of living and being in the world. I had a lot of practices already in place. And this, sometimes in the work I do with women, I talk about it as upgrading our inner operating system. So
Right.
we could say I had a particular operating system already installed from the work I was doing, which wasn't just about my training, but was also about my lived experience. And that operating system definitely was helpful. And I would say the experience itself more deeply installed that. I mean, that was the question really I was living in was, would this operating system, this way of being in the world, hold up in the most
Right.
impossible circumstances one I could have imagined?
Right. Right. And did you learn or experience anything you weren't expecting?
Well, I don't think I was expecting any of this.
Well,
So
no, I mean, as far as your own internal reactions and responses, all your training might have indicated, this is what grief is. Did you experience
hmm.
anything that was contrary or new from what you had learned and researched?
I wouldn't say contrary, no. What
Okay.
I did realize was there were many things I would say I understood. I'd also gone through other hard losses before,
Right.
um, but nothing of this magnitude. And
Okay.
what I would say was confirmed was in what I knew to some extent, and partly through my work and my other losses, was the necessity to really learn to be in the dark, to learn to see in the dark in a way is
Mm.
something, one of the
Oh,
expressions I
okay.
say. Like you can't, that there is something in the dark when you are pulled, when life brings you a situation that could be the loss of a loved one, it could be the loss of a career, it could be a divorce, it
Right.
could be the loss of health. If you've got a health
Hmm.
crisis, whatever that is, that there is that you are pulled or yanked into the dark, and actually to learn to be in the dark. And what does that mean? What can I see there? What happens for me there? As opposed to, and what I'm trying to say is almost like sometimes in those moments it feels like I just need to get back to where I was. Like that's
Hmm.
the incentive. And I
Right.
want to get to somewhere back to the light, please. And of course, the light is more comfortable. We want that.
Sure.
But what I really learned and deeply understand now was, well, we only ever have this moment anyway. We only ever have this day. And this is my day. The day is this, and it's dark and it's hard, but I'm not getting it back. It's like, this is my life right now.
Right.
It's not that my life is going to happen later. It's like my life is happening now. And
Right.
can I really be with this now?
I like that. I like that a lot. I feel I had a lot of those moments as well that I didn't necessarily like where I was, but I was able to acknowledge that that's the reality for the moment. I can hope for something better tomorrow or even later today, but for the moment, this is where I am. And I would spend a lot of time in those moments remembering, remembering, especially with my husband, remember just recreating memories in my mind of better times that we had. The first time I took him on a cruise, when he stood with a mariachi band and just played and had fun. All of those fun memories is what I would try to recall at those moments that was really dark, just so that I could get a feeling that I was going to make it back
Hmm.
to the light, that I was going to make it to the next day or something like that. You used the phrase developmental trauma. I know because of my own personal history and experience, as I mentioned, about not grieving correctly or fully the losses that I experienced earlier in my life. I guarantee there are millions of people around the world that experienced the same thing. Is that not grieving fully at the time, can that be considered developmental trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because that would be basically what I think of, or you can think of as developmental trauma, is when the feelings are bigger than your system can handle. Your
Okay.
nervous system gets overwhelmed. And
Right.
so it's less almost trauma about what happens to you externally than what happens to you internally. So the trauma is it's overwhelmed me. And
Mhm.
so rightly, our systems, especially when we're younger or when we go through a big trauma, they can't you can't handle all of that. So you shut it
Mhm.
down. Now that does not mean that those feelings aren't there, as you've already expressed, how you
Exactly.
discovered when you
Right.
got to a ground, that you could you actually found the whole circuitry. The same thing I would say. My mother died when I was quite young. I was just about to turn 30,
Mhm.
and she had a very sudden, massive heart attack. And she was my dry ground. She was my home base. Very very
Sure.
important person in my life.
Right.
And I didn't really grieve that fully. I couldn't grieve it fully. In fact, I would say at that time I did a spiritual bypass where I
Oh.
had a very, deep spiritual practice, and I kind of went into it's all fine and she's in a better place and it's all, I didn't really deeply grieve. And there were ways in which when David left, I had more capacity now for sure. That was one
Mhm.
thing. There was, as you experienced, there was the grieving for him, this loss, because he was my beloved partner. And
Sure.
I lost not just David, I also lost my home. I lost everything that came
Sure.
apart at the same time. But I also felt the, I felt there was a way I was able to work with some of that earlier grief around my mother
Mhm.
at the same time, and that was important to do, actually.
Right. At what point in grief, if there is a way to identify at what point, do you think women primarily are ready to consider this mysterial concept?
Well, I would say the mysterial concept is. I don't think that's what my book is a mysterial concept. Let me just
Okay.
say
All
that.
right.
I don't think my new book is a mysterial concept. I think it's a memoir where I'm
Right.
writing very personally about how I moved through the difficult journey that I went through.
Mhm.
And so I would say, and I've had women, initially, many women I've been speaking to
Mhm.
now speak to me about how useful the book has been for them,
Okay.
to either because they're going through something or because they've been able to see, to read it, and when they've been through something and see the capacity they've actually grown
Mhm.
already. And in many ways, this book is the book I wish that I had been able to find when David died, because I
Mhm.
was looking for something that was very personal. I wanted to know somebody knew had been through something
Right.
hard,
Right.
but I also wanted some sense of there's a path. I'll make the path, but give me some sort of markers along the way.
Right.
So, I don't know if I would say there's a moment. I think when you go through the shock of grief, there's very little that's soothing at that point. So I suppose,
Mhm.
immediately the book might not be useful um, to somebody. I don't know that any book is useful in the first period of
It's
time.
very difficult to read more than a sentence or two, as I recall.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, this is not, of course, your first book, as you mentioned already. And it's, I'm sure, not going to be your last book. Are you already working on something new?
I'm not. No, this is barely out the birth canal that comes out on June 13th. And, it's a little bit like, when you haven't given birth to your child and someone says you're going to have another
Right.
one. At this point, I will say writing a book is not easy. And
No, it's not.
the first book was not easy. But then, just like with children, you say, I'll never do this again. but then
Hmm.
enough years go by and you forget how hard it was.
Yeah. What would you suggest? What recommendations, and I'm using the plural, would you offer to women who are, well, stuck, for lack of a better word, for women that just can't seem to find their way out of that darkness? They maybe don't have a good support network. Do you have anything that you would offer
Mm.
to women as far as advice or suggestions?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it's hard. The learning to see in the dark is hard. It's very hard. Um, and I can say there is something in that breaking open that happened for me, and happens, I think, is possible, that can reveal to you something larger than the loss itself. So there's first of all just that possibility to hold open that possibility. And then I would say self-compassion is enormously helpful and important right now. We know the neuroscience of that, of just being able to turn toward yourself and say, this is really hard right now, May I be kind to myself? May I be gentle with
Hmm.
myself? Like really, sometimes we're the hardest on ourselves. We think we should be out there and figuring it all out and doing it all. So there's
Right.
something about the tender compassion. Now, I do think that, and this is in the title of my book, You Make Your Path by Walking. I do think movement in the cycle of grief is important. Now, I don't mean there aren't times when you need to just sit and stare out a window, because there are, and that stillness is a part of the movement, you could say.
Right.
But there is something about, I was very deliberate every day about moving my body, just
Right.
getting my body moving. We know this from the psychology and neuroscience, that the nervous system and the body needs to move, and big emotions like grief, and I also worked with fear and anger and some of these big feelings. Moving your energy is really, really important. So even just getting out, walking your dog every day, getting out. You don't need to know where you're going. You walk around a couple of blocks and come back. You have that as a practice, that you move, because this too, it's hard when you're right in the darkest moment to believe
Hmm.
that this too
Hmm.
shall pass,
Right.
but it will. And that's actually the way feelings move. They are like a wave front. I often think of the heart like an ocean. And
Hmm.
feelings they rise and fall if we don't either over attach to them or, you know, deny them.
Hmm.
So, learning to ride those waves is really important.
Okay. That's very helpful, and makes a lot of sense. Movement, and I also heard self-compassion instead of self-care, and I've heard that a couple times now recently, and I like that better than self-care. It's more than just getting a pedicure. It's just
Right.
really being gentle with yourself and patient with yourself as well.
Well, it's kind of the place from which you would go and have a pedicure. In other words,
Yes.
self-compassion is you're being so kind and gentle with yourself, and you're really tuning in to this wounded
Yes.
being,
Yes.
and like the healthy mother would do. The healthy mother saying, "What do you need today, sweetie?
Right.
Oh, do you need to have somebody rub your feet and have
Right.
hot water? Okay, let's go to a
Yeah.
pedicure." It's kind of from that
Yeah.
place. Hmm.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that. Definitely. I'm going to use self-compassion more than self-care now, I think. Okay, one question for you as a trained professional. Do you consider grief to be a mental illness?
That's an interesting question. There's absolutely no way that I consider grief to be a mental illness. So I don't know what your
Okay.
point of view is on this, but I do not hold it like that. Actually, I hold it as a necessary and essential part of our human
Right.
experience. Grief is unfortunately been stigmatized in our culture, and we try to get rid of it, and we make it wrong, and we tell people when they should be through it and moving through it, and oh, you must be sick. if you are grieving, I think there can be, let's say, mental concerns. If that goes on for such a long period of time, it could turn into something.
Right.
But on its own, grief is the most natural thing we know. So no, is my answer.
Thank you. Thank you. I know there was recently a somewhat new DSM-4 diagnosis, I believe, for a particular type of grief. So it just begged the question to me, are we moving toward that
I'm not.
concept or that idea? Thank you. That where they're going to eventually say that if you're grieving, you're mentally ill. And I would hate to see that because,
Well, let's just remember, we could go all the way back to the old days. The olden days, they weren't that far away, where women's anger was codified as so bad that when women would be hysterical or go through their menstrual cycle and have a lot of feelings, they would be told they need to have their electrotherapy, like shock therapy, or have
yes,
their ovaries removed, or
yes,
so I think there are some crazy things that are maybe happening on the fringes there, but I certainly do not hold the view that would be correct for any of our emotions to be made wrong. But
right.
for sure, if we do not have access to the proper, I mean, a sociopath or a psychopath, they
Hmm.
have a very bad access, a low capacity to actually work with the emotion of anger, let's say.
Yes, yes,
That's true. But anger itself is not the problem.
right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Our time is winding down, and before I start to wrap up, I want to take the opportunity and pass the microphone to you, Suzanne, so that you can speak directly to our listeners without me interrupting with comments or questions. And just tell them whatever you want to let them know. Tell them when your book is coming out, how to get it, and anything else you might have in store for them.
All right. Well, for those of you listening, obviously you're here in this podcast stream with Kathy because you are in the midst of a situation that's very difficult and you are grieving. And I want to just say that I think that requires, and I know from my own experience, requires a lot of courage to be in the darkness. And you are not alone. That there are, as you're finding here on this podcast, and you there is, and I know in my own case, I found my own heart breaking open, also opened me to many others. I felt so much connection and compassion for all beings, and I still do, but I certainly did during the heightened time of the grieving, the initial phase of grieving. So really let this break your heart open and let it break it into the world for more love, not less love. And that's something I think that's possible. And my book is really pointing there. It's pointing toward the possibility of letting this path unfold before you. You make your path by walking into a new life where you might find and you can find more of yourself. You can find not just happiness again, let's say, but potentially a life that's unimaginable right now to you. In other words, that's possible that your life can take you somewhere new now that will always carry within it the losses that you have had. I will always have my late husband David in my heart and all of our that we experienced together, and I bring that with me, the best of that, into my life going forward. And yeah, you can find me at my website, which is this word mysterial that Kathy was asking me to define, mysterial woman.com. Everything about my work, which is with women, is there. There's also a page on the website for my book, So You Make Your Path by Walking. My book is available now to pre-order. I'm not sure when this podcast is coming out, but it does come out officially on June 13th, so you can get it then. I have an event coming up the end of June, which is a book launch and a workshop on June 22nd. It's 90 minutes together where we'll kind of just dip our toes into the territory that is laid out in my second book, You Make Your Path by Walking.
Sounds great. You mentioned the date this podcast is coming out. It actually will launch on May 30th.
Oh,
so
great.
that will be just a little bit before your book will be out. I do encourage our listeners to grab a copy of the book. You will very much enjoy the memoir aspect of it with Suzanne's description of what she went through herself. You may find yourself on similar parallel days at different times in the experiences. You probably will be curious enough that you may want to check out her other book, The Mysterial Woman, as well. If that entire thing intrigues you, it does me. So I will be getting that book as well and maybe taking it on a vacation coming up very soon. I'm not going to mention self-care today like I usually do when I close, because I'm going to instead choose self-compassion. I like that concept a lot. I think that's going to grow on me as well. Learn to be compassionate with yourself. Give in as you need to things. Be patient, be understanding. At the same time, get up and move, as Suzanne suggested. We need that movement so that we can just kind of get things going. So it's not a bad thing. I do love the stillness, but maybe instead I'll get up and leave my home and go find stillness in the outdoors. And maybe I'll find one of those paths that diverged again, as Robert Frost said. I just love that poem. It means so much to me. And I find myself thinking of it almost on a daily basis about the path I've been on. And I know that up there somewhere soon is going to be another fork, and I'm going to have another decision to make. Who knows which way I'll go? As always, the information to Suzanne's website and everything will be on the episode notes. It'll be on our website as well when everything launches. So we encourage you to reach out to Suzanne, ask her questions. She has a retreat coming up, as I recall, in June. That might intrigue you as well.
Actually, no, we're not going to be having that retreat. It's not.
Okay.
That won't be happening this time. We've
All right.
scheduled it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then you can watch your website maybe for the next one that might come up.
Definitely get on a mailing list. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mailing lists are great. And, I take great encouragement sometimes in those emails that I get. A lot of people look at them as a nuisance in their mailbox. I always look forward to them because people, especially that are trained professionals in the realm of grief, there's always a tidbit in that email that comforts me, that supports me. And I find there's always some words in there that I need on that particular day. So until then, everyone, I do hope you'll come back and listen to our next episode and the ones afterward. If you've missed any, they're all on our website or all on any podcast app. Please take care of yourselves. Practice self-compassion. Again, thank you, Suzanne. And we'll catch you next time as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveinggrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.